And I want to invite today my good friend Collin Packer. Collin is in the Church Relations Department, the Director of Church Relations at City Square, an organization here in the Dallas area. I'll let him tell you more about City Square, but at the moment, I just want to say welcome, Collin, and tell us about yourself a little bit.
Yeah, thank you so much, Trey. So I was in full-time ministry for 13 years as a senior pastor, served in Denver at a church near there, and then in Allen, which is on the north side of DFW. And we'll probably talk a little bit today about some transition in my life, but recently, this last year, there was a transition for me out of full-time church ministry into this new work in the nonprofit world. For me, resilience starts in that place of making sure that I'm not just doing this on behalf of others, but that there's this fullness that comes, that it's the overflow of my life that is getting born out in my ministry to others. And so that became really apparent over the last couple of years as we've seen people move on from career to career. I've been in that transition myself. We can speak more to that, but I think we saw that a lot of us weren't full with our tanks when it came to this season, and it's led to all kinds of difficulty, challenge. We see rates of domestic violence that's increasing within homes. We're seeing substance abuse and all kinds of issues that I think are just waiting for us when that life is not full. And so I remember one of my professors talking about how in our discipleship or our spiritual rhythms are really about preparing ourselves for only God knows what, that we never know what's around the corner, that we say vows in a marriage and we never know what that might mean down the line. We bring kids into the world and never know what challenges may be faced. And so I think that's the starting place for resiliency, is making sure that our tanks are full. It took about 7 years, I would say 5 years, when I had my first sense that this was probably not going to be my forever calling in full-time ministry, to become comfortable with the fact that this identity is changing. First, it happened with my wife. My wife came to me through a difficult season and said, "I don't think I can do this anymore." And at that time, I wasn't ready to make that transition. And so I had to get comfortable with the fact that, okay, it's important in ministry for me to realize that my wife is much as a part of this. My kids are as much a part of this as my own calling, and we discern this together. And so she was very patient with me to walk through that for a long season of challenge. It probably left some trauma in her life that she's going to have to continue to walk through, like I've got my own. And but it was important for her to name that so that I could begin that transition myself. But that wasn't a smooth process, and it was kind of moment by moment that things began to be revealed that, I'm more of a prophet than I'm a pastor. And that became a challenge as I began to speak up about things that mattered in my own life that I felt called to speak up on. And yet the reality is that there are calls for pastors to love their church well through that transition. A pastor is not a prophet's not a good prophet if they don't love their people enough to tell them the truth, but tell them the truth in a way that they can manage that and walk through that well. And so I began to realize that there's some makeup to me personally that is not going to be a good mix long term in at least this particular congregation. And man, the last few years were difficult years in many ways. It's not just pandemic for ministers right now. There are issues of when do you require people to wear a mask, and what happens when people come in and they choose not to? What are you going to decide about how you're going to speak up about Black Lives Matter, about social issues that may be coming up in this season? Those are challenges that every minister's facing. And it can be so easy, your ministry, your preaching, to be led by the news channels, unfortunately, right now, because it feels like every week there's another tragedy that you've got to figure out. Is this something that I deal with in the welcome? Is this something that we say a prayer about for 5 minutes during a pastoral moment? Is this something I rewrite my sermon this week because it's so important? July 7th was one of those weeks in Dallas of 2017, I believe it was, when Alton Sterling and Philando Castile were shot and killed, African-American men, like we've seen so many times over the last few years. And yet in my own city in Dallas, there was this challenge of 5 police officers that were killed at a protest. And how do you speak to all these realities? And so I know ministers are walking through that just at a heightened pace over the last couple of years. And so that resiliency to try to figure out, how do you walk through those things? I don't see myself as a casualty of COVID. I see myself as a casualty of the culture wars over the last 5, 6, 7 years in particular, particularly the last presidency and what that looked like walking in an evangelical-esque type church. it was really hard to figure out how do you hold a church together in the midst of all the decisions, and pandemic only increased that. And so there was certainly a resiliency of trying to walk through that with a full bucket, as I talked about before, realizing you can't please everyone, and realizing that your first commitment is to God and to be faithful to the gospel, and then to walk pastorally beside your people. But there's also this realization that in your community, there are these communities, marginalized communities, that need people to speak up and advocate for them. And so certainly there was a resiliency in that season. But I think, and so it was over that season that I began to say, I need to go to these elders and say, I need a transition. I'm grateful in my situation. They were willing to walk with me in a season through that. I was due a sabbatical after a 7-year period in my church that they honored, which I'm really grateful for. And I think their generosity, I would say that to those who are on boards, those who are leading churches, it is really important that you allow your minister the best transition possible. And that's not just for your minister's sake or for your minister's family's sake. That's for your church's sake. They need to see you honor them. The same for the next minister who's going to come in. The more you honor the minister on their way out, the better you're able to say to the minister that's going to be on their way in, we're going to take care of you. And there's some truth behind that. I could say that to the minister who's coming after me and they handled me well. They loved us as well as they could through a challenging time.
There's a lot of ministers who are saying goodbye to ministry. And Collin, you were one of those that said, church work, church-based ministry is not where I need to be anymore. And your story is not an uncommon one. We see it in the statistics from Barna, but we also see it just anecdotally in talking with people and in paying attention to what's happening around us. You experienced that firsthand. Talk to me about the resilience it required to say, it's time to move on, and the resilience required to actually live in that odd space until you actually did leave the church where you were working.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know that I've had that question posed, but I think it's a good way to pose it. Of what was the resilience of making the decision to leave? I know it can feel to many like, man, I feel like I'm quitting on a calling or a career. I never went into this thinking this would be, a first career. I thought it was going to be the ministry I would lead forever. It's been basically 19 years that I served in the role of learning how to go into ministry and internships, and then 6 years in one church, 7 years in another. And so almost 20 years of church ministry. I spoke about grief and lament a moment ago. It doesn't matter if there's a good change that's happening in your life, transition, or a bad change. Every transition has 3 zones. It has an end to something. It has that kind of wilderness in between moment, neutral zone, and then there's this new beginning. And I think it's vital that you learn to not just focus on what may be new, or not just focusing to the past on what has come and ended, but walking through each of those zones is going to be really important in order to land well. And as I said, there's distress in hard transitions. There's also eustress in good change, and realizing that even a good change, if you don't lament, I mean, every challenge in the past needs to be lamented and grieved, because there were good things in that season that may be hard to find in the midst of a firing, in the midst of whatever it may be that was that hard transition. And if you don't take the time to lament, I heard a minister friend recently that was stepping out of ministry, and he talked about how it was important for him before he left the church he was at to walk through every room in that building with his family. And not just to speak to the hard moments. There were rooms where he had hard conversations with church members, with elders, whatever it may have been. But there were also good moments that were important to remember. I thought that was such a valuable practice, ritual to walk through that season and not just say, how can I not let the door hit me on my way out? How can I hand off the keys and move on? But my family's been impacted by this building, by these people. And to not lament and celebrate the moments that have been there won't allow me to move forward. And so I thought that was a great practice. And I wish I'd had the foresight to do that in my own ministry. But then there's the time to make the transition. And for 8 months for me, it was that transition and not knowing and trying to do everything I could. It was a full-time job basically for me to find a new job. And I had to realize that this isn't something that I'm able to take 20 hours a week at. It was 30 to 40 hours a week that I was trying to put into transitions. I had to write a new resume. I had to find new contacts and recommendations, references that would mean something to the world I was walking into. And I had to figure out what I was wanting to do. I looked at law school for a season. I applied and took the LSAT, and that didn't go so well. And so that was a challenge to realize maybe this isn't what was next. I looked in the corporate world for some opportunities that could have surfaced, and I looked in the nonprofit world that made sense for me. And I know there's a lot of people that end up different places, a lot of people that have to do just whatever they have to do to get by. And gratefully, in my season, I was able to make that transition to something that felt like a real calling at City Square. So I'm grateful for the place I'm in. No, it's smoother than a lot of people who are out there, but it doesn't change the fact that lament and grief and that neutral zone of walking through that well, as well as the excitement about the new phase, that each of those three stages was going to be vital. But it's been a transition to no longer be the, the top of the triangle or the bottom of the triangle, however you want to invert that leadership model. But right now I'm at mid-level, and I knew that was what I was going to be moving into. And so for the first time, I have a boss that's not a group of elders, but someone who's here in the office every day, right? That I meet with, that I report to. That's a new system. I have people above me that are making decisions about strategic plans for this group, people that have been here a lot longer than I have. And but I'm just relishing this opportunity right now to be able to be in the office, to get to learn, to be able to be mid-level, to be able to see nonprofit leadership, that there are things I don't know about how to lead an organization. And I know in 10, 20 years, then maybe there'll be an opportunity for me to lead again in that number one spot. But I won't get to do that in the same way and learn what I can without walking in with the curiosity it takes to be a learner again. And that can be hard when you're in midlife, you're in mid-career, you're making a transition to something else. You feel like you deserve the respect that maybe you had before. Um, I don't think we need to walk in deserving respect. I think we need to go in respecting and honoring those who've been there before us, realizing that we've got a ton to learn. And that's what really endears people to you. That's how you rise up the ladder, is not through leadership and presuming place, but realizing that you got a ton to learn. As people see that, as people see your curiosity, your humility, you're willing to be a learner, I think that's where opportunity arises. And that's the model of Jesus, is a model of realizing that there was no one beneath him. Everyone was an opportunity for him to learn, for him to be a patient listener, to understand their story, to realize that, I remember that story where he heals the lame man, but he says, "Do you want to be healed?" Right? Sometimes we come in and we assume things, and Jesus was even willing to ask that question. I'm not going to presume myself and bring salvation where it's not wanted. What do you need? Do you really want healing? What's that going to mean? And then he's able to provide what's needed. So I think that model of Jesus is what I'm trying to follow imperfectly.
Yeah, I love the way you said that, Colin. In particular, the idea of being a learner and having curiosity. I've seen that again and again in ministers who are leaving. Those who come with a learner's mentality, a curiosity mentality, who manage the expectations of what this new job will be like compared to what it was like to lead in ministry, or even with associate or student ministry or children's. But managing those expectations and instead coming with a sense of curiosity, a willingness to learn, and a willingness to be patient. To me, those are key elements of resilience. And so I appreciate you putting it that way, because we sometimes think of resilience so much as, I just got to keep trying hard and keep trying hard and don't stop working and don't stop, don't stop, don't stop. And the implication of being curious and learning is to stop, to slow down, and just see the moment for what it is. So that is a really important and a critical lesson that I hope not only the pastors who watch this today hear, but also for those who are donors of 1128, or those who are serving in churches in volunteer ways. In what ways can you bring a learner's mentality to what it is your pastors are experiencing? Because that will help them nurture the resilience they need to either make the hard decision to stay or make the hard decision to go.